One of the best outcomes we consistently hear about in carnivore and keto spaces are the testimonies from people who say that their mental health improved dramatically when they adopted a proper human diet, whether it's carnivore, keto, or something in between. Those stories are everywhere. It was true for me, and I'm sure it's true for many of you watching this. This way of life has done wonders for my own health and well-being. But there's an interesting study from Italy that takes this a step further. A group of scientists tested the effects of ultra-processed foods on mental health. Think a diet heavy in Doritos or soft drinks, frozen meals, or the Italian equivalents thereof, and you get the idea. The findings of this study are in fact so interesting that if you aren't having the outcomes you are expecting on your keto or carnivore diet and you're still consuming processed foods, you may want to pay attention. And it's not a controversial statement to say that we should avoid processed foods. That's pretty par for the course. No one advocates for a diet heavy in processed foods, but many of us still make that compromise. And it leads to bad outcomes. In fact, according to this study, even a small amount of them may lead to some pretty bad outcomes. So with that having been said, headline from News Medical and Life Science, study indicates that ultra-processed foods are linked to depression. Now, first, I hate that title. Studies don't really usually indicate anything. At best, they suggest something, in this case, that ultra-processed foods may be linked to depression. Obviously, let's remember what the purpose of a study is: to test the relationship between variables and to gather and present data based on that relationship so other researchers can test the findings of a study before action is taken. But still, this is an interesting study nonetheless because it does support what most of us have been saying for some time. Eating too much processed foods can lead to poor mental health outcomes. In fact, could be any amount of them leads to poor mental health outcomes. From the article, quote, highly processed foods, also called ultra-processed foods or UPFs, are widely recognized as predisposing to various medical conditions due to their adverse impact on metabolic pathways. However, less is known about their effect on mental health. A recent research paper explored this aspect, showing a positive association in younger Italians between ultra-processed food intake and depressive symptoms, which could point the way for further research in this field. Ultra-processed foods are a nova category of foods, quote, characterized by formulations containing few or no natural ingredients, supplanted with chemical additives and preservatives to prolong shelf life, but also to supply intense palatable features and properties, i.e. flavor enhancers, colorants, emulsifiers, artificial sweeteners, thickeners, and foaming/anti-foaming agents. While ultra-processed foods may compromise up to a fifth of daily energy intake in Mediterranean countries, this proportion rises to as high as 80% in highly westernized populations like the US, Canada, and Australia. Research indicates that the health risks of ultra-processed foods are not associated with their poor nutritional quality alone. The current paper, published in the journal Nutrients, looks at ultra-processed foods in relation to depressive symptoms in a group of younger Italian adults. The data came from the Mediterranean Healthy Eating, Aging, and Lifestyle Study, the MEAL study, which investigated the linkage between lifestyle behaviors and non-communicable diseases in Mediterranean countries. End quote. Okay, so this is a behavioral study, and it will be one that is based on self-reported data. It's always a good idea to remind ourselves of the fact that self-reported nutrition data is almost always inaccurate. This is our usual response to these kinds of surveys promoted by the plant-based zealots or by those who say that a clean version of a standard American diet is the way to go. Nutrition studies are, in fact, almost always based on self-reported data simply because there really isn't an ethical way to control all the food people take in on a daily basis. With that caveat stated, let's take a look at these findings here. Quote, the scientists found that unmarried and physically active individuals had a higher average consumption of ultra-processed foods. Conversely, a high UPF intake was linked to significantly moving away from the Mediterranean diet, characterized by natural foods, including whole grains, nuts, dairy, legumes, olives, grapes, and other fruit, vegetables, and fish, with wine and olive oil. The highest ultra-processed food intake was associated with increased consumption of micronutrients and sodium, as well as higher total consumption of food and processed food. In contrast, this group had significantly lower consumption of fruits, cereals, vegetables, legumes, dairy, and olive oil, which are prominent in the Mediterranean diet. Notably, the highest ultra-processed food intake was associated with twice as high a chance of depressive symptoms after compensating for energy intake. This remained the same even when adjusting for factors like age, sex, occupation, smoking, physical activity. When the Mediterranean diet adherence was considered, those with the highest ultra-processed food intake were almost 3 times as likely to have depressive symptoms. End quote. So there are a lot of bad associated health behaviors that by themselves obviously cause or make these symptoms and worse on their own. That shouldn't be surprising to anyone in the least. Now, how many of you watching this noticed that your depression or similar issues went away after going onto a carnivore or keto diet? I know that I did, and I know for a fact that I'm not alone in that either. What's interesting is that higher levels of depression remain constant, even after controlling for some of those extraneous factors. To say the least, though, the implications are more than interesting because it turns out that increasing your processed food intake by only a small amount is associated with massive increases in depression. Quote, the findings of this study suggest that high ultra-processed food consumption are linked to higher odds of depressive symptoms. This holds true even when the nutritional quality of the diet is accounted for. The Mediterranean diet is a proxy for a healthy diet, yet following it more closely failed to compensate for increased ultra-processed food intake and instead increased the chances for depressive symptoms. This indicates that other dietary components affect the impact of ultra-processed foods on mental health. This corroborates earlier research showing that depressive symptoms increased by 1/5 when ultra-processed food consumption increased by 1/10 in a French cohort, while the risk of depression went up by 1/3 when the average ultra-processed food intake increased. Other studies from the US and Brazil also showed similar associations. End quote. So the takeaway: avoid processed foods as much as you can. You can't balance out eating a bunch of processed foods by eating an otherwise healthy diet. If you're having trouble with your keto or carnivore diet and you're experiencing mental health problems, cut out anything processed that you might be taking in. Obviously, now this study needs other scientists to replicate the process to test the findings, but this is easy enough for you to do on your own as a personal intervention that you should be able to test as a way of troubleshooting your problems with your keto or carnivore diet. You won't need a professional for this to just clean up your diet. What did you think of this study? Are you surprised by its findings? Do you think that because it's going to be self-reported data that it's probably not trustworthy? Let me know in the comments, please. Like and subscribe if you haven't. It does help, as does sharing this on social media. That helps too. I'm Anthony Stine, the Practical Carnivore. Thanks for tuning in.